Once upon a time, there was a girl who inspired millions of immigrants to march out of the shadows. Her name is Tereza. Tereza grew up in Northwest Chicago, where she lived in a basement apartment with her mom, dad, and little brother. She loved her family, but life wasn't easy. Tereza's parents, who were from South Korea, had lost everything in the aftermath of the Korean War. They had fled to Brazil, where Tereza was born, and started a successful clothing business. However, one day, a family member stole all their money. Left with nothing and no one to turn to, Tereza's parents decided to move to the United States. Tereza's mom sold her most prized possession, her wedding ring, and used the money to buy plane tickets. I'm Laurene Powell Jobs, and this is Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, a fairy tale podcast about the rebel women who inspire us. This week, Tereza Lee. In 1985, when Tereza was 2 years old, her parents took her on a plane bound for the U.S., where they believed they could create a better life for their family. But in Chicago, that better life seemed out of reach. The family's apartment had no furniture, no heat, and no hot water. Tereza shivered through the cold winters, and at other times, hunger gnawed at her belly. Then, one day, when Tereza was around 7 years old, her family received an incredible gift. Tereza's father was a minister, and when one parishioner saw how they were living, she filled their apartment with furniture, including an upright piano. Tereza was drawn to the instrument immediately. She played piano at the church before, and when her fingertips glided across the cool keys, her troubles always melted away. Tereza practiced on her new piano for hours and hours. The better she became, the more her mind filled with images of herself on a stage, playing to crowds and becoming a successful musician. A bold vision grew in her head. Tereza would help her family escape poverty. She would help them stay safe, and the piano would help her do it. By the time Tereza was 9, she'd memorized almost 500 hymns and had become the pianist at her church. But when she wasn't at the piano, Tereza was determined to attract as little attention as possible. From the outside, she just looked shy. She didn't have a lot of friends, and she didn't whisper secrets on the playground. This was because her family had a very big secret, a scary secret. One that, if someone found out, could break her family apart. She had found out about it when she was just 7 years old. Her father once called Tereza and her brother into the living room for a family meeting. "We are undocumented," he said, his voice grave. "We don't have this paper that says we're allowed to live here. There's this thing called a green card and a citizenship, and we have neither." Tereza's father said that if the U.S. government found out, their family would be separated. Tereza would be sent to Brazil. Her parents would be sent to Korea. And her brother, who was born in the U.S., would go into the foster care system. Fear shot through Tereza's body like lightning. What if she lost her family, or was sent to a country she didn't even remember? She promised her dad she wouldn't tell anyone, ever. From then on, Tereza was haunted by nightmares. In her dreams, police knocked down their door, stormed into their apartment, and tore her family apart. Often, she woke up drenched in cold sweat. Tereza withdrew from friends and avoided authority figures like teachers and the police. She wanted to be like the other kids in her class, but her immigration status was a constant barrier. For example, when Tereza was in 7th grade, she was so smart, her teacher said she should go straight to high school. But when she brought the paperwork home to her father, he tore it to pieces. "You're undocumented," he said. "You can't stick out." Tereza was devastated. And then a more serious injustice happened. One winter when Tereza was 14, her brother was hit by a car. At the hospital, her father told the police it was her brother's fault, even though it wasn't. He didn't want to press charges against the driver or go to court, because if he did, the police would find out they were undocumented. So instead, he lied. Tereza's brother recovered, but because of that lie, Tereza's family nearly went bankrupt trying to pay for his medical bills. This felt terribly wrong, and Tereza longed to do something. But she had no idea what that something was. Tereza had taught herself piano, but as she got older, she wanted a teacher. So at 16 years old, Tereza applied to the Merit School of Music. She received a full scholarship and studied with world-class musicians. It was a big deal. Soon after, one of her mentors and teachers, Anne Monaco, called Tereza into her office. "What colleges are you planning on applying to?" she asked. "I'm not going to college," Tereza said sheepishly. Tereza looked at her hands. She wanted to tell Anne the real reason why she wasn't filling out applications. Since Tereza was undocumented, some universities wouldn't accept her. And for those that would, it would be nearly impossible to get a scholarship. But then she remembered her father's words and the danger that awaited them if anyone found out. So, Tereza remained silent. Meanwhile, Anne printed off 10 college applications. "Fill these out and bring them back to me tomorrow," she said. Tereza took the stack of papers home and filled them out. The next day, she handed them to Anne. As Anne reviewed the applications, she saw a specific answer was blank on each one. Tereza's Social Security number, a number the government gives to citizens and documented immigrants. She told Tereza to go home and ask her parents for it. Again, Tereza took the stack of papers home, but she didn't show them to her parents. She knew she didn't have that number. The next day, Tereza simply took the stack of papers back to Anne. "Why is this empty?" Anne asked again. Tereza's eyes filled with tears. She felt like the walls were closing in. As Anne looked on, confused, Tereza told her their secret. She was undocumented. "Please don't report me to the police," Tereza said. Anne promised not to tell the police. And then she promised Tereza something else. Together, they'd do something about this problem. Anne thought hard about how she could help Tereza. Eventually, she started calling and writing letters to Dick Durbin, a U.S. Senator from Illinois. Moved by Tereza's story, Senator Durbin decided to write a private bill on Tereza's behalf that would offer her legal residency. But once word got out about this bill, an unexpected thing happened. Young people from all over started contacting Senator Durbin, sometimes by phone, sometimes by letter. At other times, they'd covertly seek him out in the parking lot after he finished work. They told him their stories. They were immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children, too. Could he help them? Senator Durbin quickly realized that this issue went way beyond Tereza's case. Inspired by these young people's stories, he collaborated with Senator Orrin Hatch and other allies to develop the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act. The 2001 DREAM Act, as it was called, was legislation that would offer permanent residency to qualifying immigrants who were brought to the United States as children. The DREAM Act gained massive support from both Democrats and Republicans. Even President George W. Bush promised he'd sign the bill into law. After so many years of living in the shadows, hope and support for undocumented immigrant youth like Tereza was just a vote away. The Senate was scheduled to vote on the DREAM Act on September 12, 2001. Tereza was planning to play a short piano concert for the senators, and then she would testify about the bill. At that time, Tereza was living in New York City. Anticipating that the DREAM Act would pass, the Manhattan School of Music had admitted Tereza on a full scholarship. On the morning of September 11th, Tereza tried to catch a taxi to go to the airport. But there were no taxis to be found. Soon after, she discovered that her flight was canceled. In fact, all flights were canceled. Something terrible had happened. 2 planes had crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City. The news was calling it a terrorist attack. Many people died. Like so many Americans, Tereza was horrified. Who would do such a thing, she wondered. As Congress responded to this crisis, the DREAM Act was hastily pushed aside. At the same time, another terrible thing happened. Suddenly, people were afraid of outsiders, including immigrants. Across the country, states passed laws making life even harder for undocumented immigrants. Raids on immigrant communities increased, and undocumented immigrants were deported from the country in large numbers. Just like in Tereza's nightmares, families were torn apart and immigrant communities were left missing loved ones and friends. She wondered how she could go on, how she could survive in a country that didn't want her. She even considered deporting herself to Brazil. As she dwelt on her pain and losses, though, Tereza came to a realization. When she had told Senator Durbin her story, she'd thought she was alone. In fact, she thought her family was the only undocumented family in the United States. But she was mistaken. She remembered the students who'd approached Senator Durbin in parking lots, who whispered their stories. And she remembered the people who, on hearing her situation, wanted to help her find a path to legal residency. I have to keep sharing my story, she realized, because there are others out there like me, because we deserve to come out of the shadows. And so she did. This young woman who'd grown up trying to make herself as quiet as possible began to speak out. Tereza spoke at demonstrations, shared her story on the news, and shouted for justice and immigration reform at rallies. Thousands joined her, and then millions. These undocumented youth, who called themselves dreamers after the DREAM Act, bravely came out and built what has become a national movement. Soon, the plight of the dreamers was at the forefront of local and national conversations about immigration. But more than that, these dreamers, who'd so long been trapped in silence, realized they were not alone, and they never would be again. The DREAM Act has been reintroduced in Congress several times since 2001, but it has yet to pass. In 2012, President Obama signed an executive order called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, which offers temporary protection from deportation for qualified undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children. Although this was a victory for many immigrant youth, DACA continues to be challenged by its political opponents. Yet thanks to the hard work of dreamers like Tereza, public support for undocumented youth has grown. Today, almost 75% of all Americans support letting dreamers stay in the U.S. Tereza became a U.S. citizen in 2010 after marrying American jazz trombonist Danny Kirkham. When she finally held the piece of paper in her hand that said she was a citizen, she cried for hours. Now a professional pianist and teacher, Tereza can still be found behind a piano, her fingers weaving notes together into beautiful melodies and harmonies. When she's not performing, teaching, or raising her 3 children, Tereza continues to fight for her dreamer siblings and other undocumented immigrants by demonstrating, advocating for immigration reform, and sharing her story. As Tereza said in one speech, telling the stories of real people is what will inspire others to take action and eventually bring down the injustice in the system.
Today's episode was hosted by Laurene Powell Jobs. Laurene is a businesswoman, executive and founder of Emerson Collective. Get to know Laurene in our interview episode, available now. This podcast is a production of Rebel Girls and Boom Integrated, a division of John Marshall Media. It's based on the book series Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls. Our executive producer is Elena Favilli, Jess Wolfe, and Katie Sprenger. This season was produced by John Marshall Cheary, Sarah Storm, and Robin Lai. Corinne Peterson is our production manager. This episode was written by Alexis Stratton and edited by Maithy Vu. Proofread by Ariana Rosas. Original theme music was composed and performed by Elettra Bargiacchi, who has also sound designed this episode. Mattia Marcelli was the sound mixer. Until next time, stay tuned and stay rebel.